I don't think I've heard that.
Natasha was very nice and tried to keep her. She's got
I guess that could have been an option, but that would have been impossible.
Okay, good afternoon. Great, you ready? Okay, there we go. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Board of Revenue Estimates second meeting of FY24. I'm Brooke Lierman, the Comptroller. I'm delighted to have Secretary Grady here. Welcome back to the Treasury Building. I hope you saw our Christmas tree. We've got a few poinsettias around. We're trying to have a little holiday spirit. I mean, it's not like Government House, but we try. And Treasurer Davis, welcome to our wing. We have screens since the last time you were here. We're slowly modernizing. It's very exciting. And we are here to review the findings and recommendations of the Revenue Monitoring Consensus Group, or the RMC. And we'll be voting on their December forecast that includes an updated forecast for FY24 general fund revenues and for FY25 general fund revenues. So at the beginning of these meetings, I want to make sure that we remind the public that the BRE forecast is for our state's general fund. The general fund represents about 40% of our annual state revenues and includes our big three taxes of personal income, corporate income, and sales and use taxes. I'll also mention at the outset that our post-COVID-19 economy continues to impact the decisions of businesses, of households, and of individual Marylanders. And that in turn impacts our state's revenue and our forecasts. To help us better understand the current trends in our economy coming out of the pandemic, the BRE has been working with our policy division on our first ever Comptroller State of the Economy report. And that report will be released early next month to kick off 2024. The report will take a close look at economic growth trends, labor force participation, and population migration and cost of living trends. It will also compare Maryland to the US and our neighboring states. The report was informed by careful review and analysis of economic data and conversations with hundreds of Marylanders and business leaders throughout the state. It's our intention that this report will be of value to a wide audience. I know it's shocking to all of you and to me that more people don't watch these BRE casts on the web, but we want to make sure that this kind of information is available to the general public, to our local leaders and our elected leaders around the state as well. So please keep an eye out for its release just after the new year. With that, I'd like to turn to the meeting and turn it over to Robert Lierman, the Director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates and the Executive Secretary of the Board, to present his report. But before I do that, I want to just acknowledge the work of Robert, of Deputy Director David Farkas, of Assistant Director Natalia Menunetz, and the rest of the team, many of whom are here today. So thank you all for your work. I appreciate it. They're an amazing asset within the Comptroller's office and to our state government. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Robert. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Comptroller. And yes, before I get to the forecast, I would definitely like to thank the BRE as well for their hard work. I'm very proud of them and very proud to be part of the team. I also like to acknowledge the members of the Revenue Monitoring Committee who are in attendance today. With that, I'll turn to the proposed forecast. For fiscal 24, our proposed general fund total is $24.6 billion. That is a slight upwards adjustment of $78.3 million. There's two adjustments that apply only to fiscal 24 that result in that upward adjustment. One is a reserve account is overfunded, and we are recognizing $150 million in extraordinary income due to that overfunding. In addition, again, for fiscal 24 only, we are raising our interest income forecast. Turning to fiscal 25, as those two impacts do not apply, we are modestly adjusting downward our proposed forecast by $162.6 million, general fund total of $24.9 billion. So looking at the different components that are driving the changes in the forecast, the very good news is our largest revenue sources are in line with our expectations, our income taxes. And again, our personal income tax is the most important general fund revenue source. And you will notice there is a very minor negative revenue amount. As we move throughout the fiscal year, we are constantly changing the calculation of how much we have to set aside to the local income tax reserve account, that went up a little bit, even though we're modestly increasing our growth rates. So our total collections are increasing slightly. However, the general fund is decreasing just by a little amount. And again, relative to total collections, it's a very minor adjustment. Now, what is driving these reductions in our forecast is slower growth in taxable consumer spending than what we assumed in September. So you see in the sales tax, roughly $150 million in each year reduction in general fund spending. I'm going to spend a little bit of the presentation kind of going through our analysis of what is occurring. So looking, as I discussed, we're raising our interest income forecast for fiscal 24. We're receiving an extraordinary amount of interest income. We received over $300 million in fiscal 23. This is a factor mainly of two things. One, the size of the state's portfolio, and interest rates. And both of those are high right now. In September, we kind of took a prudent approach, cautious, and we had a $175 million estimate, but we received sufficient data. We are increasing that to $300 million, similar to what we received in 23. So that's about 10 times the amount that we typically received in the prior 10 years. However, given uncertainty about the portfolio and interest rates, we are leaving unchanged our estimate of $100 million in 25, and we expect it to normalize over time. It's worth noting interest income, not only does it generate general fund income, but also special fund revenue for state agencies in a similar magnitude as the general fund. So take a second and say, I, in the state of Maryland, would like to thank the treasurer for generating this interest income. So tying this back to the September forecast, kind of what's changed, what has stayed the same. And notwithstanding these slower growth rates in taxable consumer spending, and again, it's not all of the spending in the economy. We only tax goods generally and certain goods. We don't tax food. Notwithstanding that, we do not see a broad-based decline in the economy that indicates a recession. Our outlook is generally consistent with our September forecast for these modest growth rates, but not a recession. And again, there were really two key assumptions in that September forecast. One was that withholding income tax revenues would grow at 4.8%, and gross receipts for the sales and use tax would grow at about 3.5%. One of the factors that we thought would have that high growth, among other things, was inflation. But as I'll discuss, our collections are lagging inflation, contrary to our expectations. Another thing to keep in mind, as we discussed in September, is recent legislation devotes a greater share of certain state revenues to special funds. So when I'm discussing general fund growth rates, that's lower than the total collections. So that's particularly applicable to the sales and use tax and the corporate income tax. So turning to our growth rates in fiscal 24, we have lowered those growth rates. And then even with the caveat of the general fund is growing slower than total collections, we now forecast in fiscal 24 that 3 of our largest 4 revenue sources will decline year over year: the sales tax, corporate, and lottery. So those declines, those modest declines in those general fund revenue sources are pushing down our ongoing general fund revenue growth from 0.9% to 0.6%. Now turning to fiscal 25, we do have a higher growth rate assumed in that year compared to fiscal 24. We have a higher growth rate for the individual income tax. And then we also, compared to 24, have a higher growth rate in the sales tax, albeit a little bit less than what we previously assumed. You'll notice there is this decline in lottery. That is not due to sales. That is due to non-general fund distributions to pay for recent capital projects. So on an ongoing general fund basis, we project that we will grow slightly less than 2% in fiscal 25. And you can go ahead and skip to the next slide. Thanks. Oh, go back one. So as I mentioned, we really haven't changed our economic outlook. This is a forecast of our jobs. We've kind of included this slower growth as we go on in the years due to our slowing population and labor force participation that has not recovered since the pandemic. But we're slightly exceeding our expectations. We're adjusting to that. And one other change that is a positive development is we're getting a higher average wage growth rate. And we're adjusting that in our forecast and increasing our expectations for wage growth. So next few slides, I'll discuss this slower growth in taxable consumer spending. Starting from left, sales tax. This is the gross receipts that we assumed minus cannabis revenues. We thought that would grow at about 3.3%. Year to date, it's growing about 1%, and we're assuming constant growth for the rest of the year. Along with that slower growth in sales tax, we're also seeing lower growth than what we assumed for other taxable consumption, lottery sales, casino revenues, and alcohol and tobacco. Although casinos do not contribute to the general fund, we do forecast them because they do contribute a significant amount of special funds, including education funding, roughly a little less than $600 million in each year. It's also a good indicator as well. It's roughly about $1.3 billion in consumer spending and entertainment, so we do track that as well. So as I mentioned, our sales tax collections have lagged inflation for roughly 4 quarters now. So when we kind of look back at this data and kind of try to determine why that's the case, I think we kind of settled on 2 factors. One, although inflation is high relative to historic norms, it's now manifesting more in services than in taxable goods. The second component is we did recently bring in faster growing online sales into the total collections, and everybody's still shopping online. We're seeing good growth there, but we're seeing flat or no change in most every categories with the exception of a couple. One of which is home improvement, and then also durable goods such as electronics and washing machines. So I think what's occurring there is we're having a little bit of a hangover from the COVID spending. There's a lot of home improvement projects, a lot of spending on the homes, and that's now more normalizing now. The second factor that may be impacting is residential construction. As we know, there's some challenges there. And then that is also feeding through to some of the components or the manufacturers of home components such as HVAC and plumbing. So they're probably getting hit from the slowdown in home improvement and then also the residential construction market. And so here we've had this basically 4 quarters of this slow growth. This is our total collections. Now, whereas we stand right now, we do have a hope that as we enter the spring, as we lap these weak quarters, we may see higher growth, but we're not planning on it in our forecast, and we're having that 1% growth. But certainly, we hope that as we lap these quarters, we may see higher growth rates of 2%, but again, we're not banking on it, and we're not planning on it in our forecast. And providing some more details on lottery sales. This takes out our jackpot games. Those are sensitive to the level of the jackpot. Once it gets to about 500 million, you see some increased consumer spending. And we're seeing some weakness in our other lottery games that manifested in the summer of this year. Notably, instant ticket sales have been a little soft. They have been growing consistently, but they have not this year as of yet, and we are adjusting downwards our expectations. As mentioned, for casino revenues, we're coming off of 2 record years. We had that pandemic boom and recovery that normalized in the spring of 2022, had some consistent growth. However, in the spring of this year, we started to see declining growth rates that continued throughout the summer. It has since stabilized in November, but again, we're kind of adjusting our forecast to this weaker than expected revenue. And I should say this is VLT gaming, it doesn't include table games. Table games are a little more volatile. Commentary from casinos were at the beginning of the fiscal year, visitation was constant, but average spend was down. There was more casinos reporting towards the current period that average spend was down as well. So I did highlight some of the challenges in the forecast, but again, the personal income tax, there is no story there because it is in line with our expectations. And again, that is very important because that is our number one revenue source. With that, I'll turn to the withholding forecast that I discussed previously. I'm sorry, back one. So in that September forecast, we had a growth rate of 4.8%. Anytime we have a growth rate that we kind of think is above our trend rate of growth rate, it gives us some pause. So we typically receive about 4%. But again, the data that we have, we are on line with our estimates, and given this higher wage growth, just modestly adjusting fiscal 24 from 4.8 to 5.1%, and we're keeping unchanged our 25 estimate. So again, that's very good news. The labor market is holding up, and there is some good wage growth as well. And lastly, I'll just finish on a little bit of a cautionary note with the personal income tax. This is cumulative revenue by component as we go through the fiscal year. This is fiscal 23, and highlighted our 3 forecast periods. So even though we're almost halfway through the fiscal year, we don't have as much visibility as we'd like on the personal income tax, particularly volatile and difficult to forecast non-wage income. We still have 2/3 of our revenue to collect from this point forward. And not only that, our refunds are backloaded as well. And I highlight this because in the last 2 years, we've had some extraordinary volatility in our final payments. In tax year 21, we had a huge surge that was unexpected, and we had expected a decline in 22, but that was greater than we anticipated. I think that was the largest 2-year volatility that we have experienced in about 45 years. So again, personal income tax, corporate income tax, very much in line, and we are making modest upwards adjustment in 24 and a modest downward adjustment in 25, primarily due to this slower taxable consumer spending. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. So I think some of the key takeaways are I always forget to push it on. Given the write-down in sales tax for FY24 and FY25, going forward, we may need to rely more on our income tax, especially on individual income tax, which is of course dependent on job growth and wage growth. And as you did hear, there are average wage, we are seeing some higher average wages, which is encouraging. And coming out of the pandemic, our labor force participation rate, though, is still 4 percentage points below what it was pre-pandemic. And if you want to work in Maryland, there are jobs out there. In fact, in Maryland, there are about 3 unfilled jobs for every job seeker, compared to only about 1.3 unfilled positions for every job seeker in the U.S. as a whole. And so our labor force participation rate is slower and lower than in many other states. And that's a trend and a challenge that we highlight in our State of the Economy report and explore more. So let me just close by reminding everyone that when we met in September, we were just days away from a potential federal government shutdown. And luckily that did not happen. It would have been devastating on our states, where of course 1 in 9 of our income tax filers receive federal income in the form of wages or retirement. Thankfully, we averted it this time, but the short-term deal that was reached in November expires next month, and we could be back on the precipice of another shutdown early next year.
Seems we're always days away from a shutdown.
We are, right? I mean, I'm not sure how this became the new normal, but it's incredibly frustrating and certainly irresponsible. So I certainly urge our federal colleagues to not let this happen. With that, I am excited to turn it over to the Treasurer and our Secretary of DBM for comments before voting on these forecast revisions. Mr. Treasurer?
Okay. First of all, thank you and welcome to everyone. Not a lot has changed since we met here last. I think Mr. Lierman and Comptroller Lierman have laid out exactly what the case is. And again, not a lot has changed. I guess all that I would add is this. Since our last meeting on September 28th, my message generally remains the same. As we navigate through these challenging economic times, we must exhibit fiscal responsibility and foresight. A lot will be said over the next few months with the upcoming session and so forth, and some might disagree with what is said, but it is imperative that we navigate a challenging time and adopt a strategic approach to managing our current state finances. I believe the governor and the General Assembly will work together to proactively manage the budget while continuing to prioritize investments that support our state and our citizens. Some of the news that we've been hearing in the last couple of days from the Fed, and perhaps we'll finally start seeing some interest rate cuts with the coming calendar year. Hopefully that'll spur the economy more and our investments and home sales and all of those kinds of things. As the comptroller mentioned, our small businesses, which are the economic engine of not just our state, really, but any state, we will give them that will give them the boost that they need, and we can continue towards an overall economic recovery. As I mentioned before, I have full faith in the governor and the members of the General Assembly that they will be, as I like to say, socially responsible and fiscally prudent, and that we will have a budget that reflects our values, but also the economic realities that we face as a state. And with that, Madam Comptroller, I will turn it over to Madam Secretary.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. And thank you, Robert. Thanks to the BRE staff for your diligent work on the modeling that supports this updated revenue forecast. As in September, once again, today's forecast makes the projected structural deficit for fiscal year 2025 a bit worse than DLS projected just last month. This pattern that we've seen now since March is indicative of the extent to which our economy and our state budget is in a period of transition. My comments today focus more on the total current revenues before the one-time distribution from reserves of $150 million that Robert described. And that's because that's really our core structural revenue. That's what we have to budget structural expense against. Total current year general fund revenues are projected to grow now only 0.6% in fiscal year 2024. That's down from 0.9% forecasted in September, with growth of only 1.8% for fiscal year 2025, also down from September's forecast. The administration has been clear from day one that the factors that drove our state's cash surplus in the fall of 2022, like many states around the country, were external to Maryland and would not be sustained. Maryland and other states benefited from billions of dollars in federal money to get us through the COVID emergency and support economic recovery. And record highs in the stock market during the pandemic resulted in temporary spikes in non-withholding income. This is why the administration with the legislature made fiscally responsible choices in our first budget together by maintaining a significant fund balance, directing $1 billion of the cash towards core investments in education and transportation funding, while maintaining 10% of revenue in the rainy day fund. And this is why we are taking a particularly disciplined approach to the fiscal 2025 budget, one that involves hard choices. The governor articulated our approach very clearly in his comments to the MACO members just last week. The administration will continue to focus on protecting the interests of our state and ensure we're on firm financial footing as we roll out our agenda. In particular, we are scrutinizing how state operating and capital dollars are directed with an eye toward prioritizing funds to the state's primary responsibilities and the key outcomes that align with our agenda. We look forward to continuing our strong partnership with the General Assembly leadership on this work in the months ahead.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Treasurer, do I have a motion to adopt the December forecast?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, the December forecast revisions are adopted. Thank you so much, Robert and the team. Thank you to the RMC members as well. And thank you all for coming. For anyone interested, we also, I believe next week, we will also be releasing the first quarter revenues from Canvas. So some news on what we brought in first quarter.
Are you going to be high? Whatever.
Well done. Well done. So we're going to try to be putting those out on a quarterly basis so folks can see what's coming in and where it's going. Put it on our website. So thank you, everybody. Happy holidays.